Uh, Arnav Dave is here.
हाँ
हाँ,
भाई।
यस।
सॉरी।
सो बस मजे में है, मजे में है। uh, I welcome Dr. Professor Ratanu Bhattacharya ji and student participants. There are 12 here and some 5 or 6 on YouTube. Very soon they will join with us, but we better begin with our work. Uh, Let me introduce Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya. He is currently serves as the chairperson, Center for English Studies, Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar, India. He ha- has done his PhD from JNU, New Delhi, 2005, with 11 journal articles, 9 book chapters, 1 authored book, and involvement in 4 research projects. Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya's work has garnered significant attention within his field. This is evidenced by 165 citations on Google Scholar. In addition, he has many honors and accolades to his credit. A few of them are British Council Hornby Trust Scholarship in 2005, UGC Research Associateship at IIAS Shimla in 2010, and IATFL Ray Tung Scholarship in 2012. He has completed research projects funded by various national and international agencies. Uh, yes, and he is, I believe, one of the very few Gujarati scholars who are equally comfortable with any topic given to him, like ICT and teaching linguistics, English language teaching, literature, literary theory, translation studies. So he is an all-rounder person so far as language and literature are concerned. On behalf of the department and on the behalf of my colleagues and student participants, I welcome you, sir. And uh, Atanuji will speak on formalism, structuralism, and post-structuralism. So over to you, Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya ji.
Thank you so much, Professor Pranav Dave, for having me over. Thanks to the Department of English again. I hope I am audible to everyone. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yes,
thank you
you're
for the
audible.
generous introduction. And it's good to have it's extremely hot in Gujarat. So I hope that I'll be able to keep you awake for the next 2 hours. I'm not going to speak for 2 hours. I'll speak for about 1 hour, 15, 20 minutes. And then we can have a discussion and any questions from the audience will be welcome. So the topic today is formalism, structuralism, and post-structuralism. Uh, I'm not going to speak too much on formalism, primarily because structuralism and post-structuralism itself is going to take a huge amount of time. And I would like to focus on that a bit more. Though I'll mention the trajectory that literary criticism, literary theory, as we call it, or critical theory, as we call it, has taken over a period of time. Now, what we call literary criticism, literary theory, critical theory today, uh, the modern version of it, not so when we do our English literature, we generally do a paper on literary criticism, which begins with Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, Sidney, etc. Now, I'm leaving that part of the history. So I'm not looking at that part of the history at all. But what I'm calling the modern literary criticism. So what we need to understand when we are looking at criticism theory, critical theory, is that there is a lineage, there is a historical progression, if you want to call it progression. So there is a historical line that we need to follow. Now, one can always almost begin with Plato, but when I say that we are going to talk about modern criticism theory, critical theory, then probably one can trace it back to the Romantics. Now, unfortunately, as students of English literature, as I'm guessing that all of you are, and we are still students of English literature, what we have been told in our syllabi is that English literary criticism has these people, Sidney, Dryden, Poe, Johnson, etc. But we also must understand that literary criticism and theory has a wider scope because many of the ideas, for example, that we find in Wordsworth and Coleridge in their literary form and their literary criticism itself is derived from European philosophy. So it's not that they were writing in abeyance. As Derrida would say, they were not writing under erasure. Yeah? So they were not writing as if they were not aware of what was happening in European continental philosophy. And therefore, one needs to be a bit aware when we are doing literary theory, literary criticism, critical theory, that there is a larger network of people talking to each other, people trying to understand each other, etc. Just to give you an example, Coleridge's idea of the secondary imagination or the primary imagination is not the original idea. Remember, it draws heavily from German philosophers like Schiller and Schopenhauer, etc. So we need to keep that in mind when we are doing theory, when we are doing things like formalism or structuralism or post-structuralism, because there is a lot of interconnection between disciplines, between what we call literature, what we call philosophy, what we call arts, architecture, history, etc. And we need to understand those intersections because they are not coming out of a vacuum. They are coming because they are responding to certain things that are happening at a certain point of time. This is the first point that I wanted to make about literary theory. Before you start reading for your net, for example, you need to understand that literary theory is not in some vacuum, that it is something to do with literature, how to read literature, etc. It comes from different disciplines, and we need to understand those disciplines, what is happening in those disciplines, like philosophy or history or anthropology, etc., and then see how literary theory responds to that. Yeah. The second thing that I wanted to say, and this is the point that I began with and I kind of digressed from that, is that what we call modern literary criticism or literary theory can be traced back probably to the Romantics. And why am I saying this? Especially to, if you're looking at English literary criticism, to the works of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Now, perhaps in a sense, what modern literary theory asks today are two central questions. So let's begin with those two central questions, and then we'll come to the major exponents of literary theory, literary criticism, etc. So one question is, what is literature? That is the central question. So how do you define literature? In philosophy, this is called an ontological question. So it is a question of ontology. That what is something? Okay. The second question, of course, is how does literature produce knowledge? Okay. So the first question that modern literary criticism, which I'm saying probably begins with Wordsworth and Coleridge, of course, we can have a discussion and debate on this. But for the time being, just go along with my argument, is that what Wordsworth, Coleridge, and people around them in Germany, for example, in France, for example, a large number of philosophers and writers are asking is what is literature? How do you define literature? Which is an ontological question. So what is something? And the second question is, how does literature produce knowledge? Which is, in philosophical terms, an epistemological question. It's a question of epistemology. Okay. And in a sense, modern criticism begins with these two primary questions. So one is the question of ontology, what is something, and what is a question, and the second is the question of epistemology. How does that something produce knowledge? So that is how they are related. Now, what all of you know, Wordsworth and Coleridge do, for example, Wordsworth in preface and Wordsworth and Coleridge in preface, and later, of course, in different kinds of writings that they do, biography, etc., is they make the poet the central figure, the bridge between what I called ontology, what is literature, and epistemology. How does literature produce knowledge? Okay. So the poet becomes the central figure over there. So the poet is the one who interprets what is literature and then disseminates that knowledge. If you remember Wordsworth's famous definition of the poet, so if you remember, it's the simplest definition of a poet that Wordsworth gives. He says a poet is a man talking to men. Okay. So the poet is the conduit. The poet is the central figure who can transform ontology into epistemology. So a poet is the person who can change what is literature into what knowledge does literature give. Now, these are central questions to literary criticism and theory. So this is the second thing that I wanted to mention. So in order to understand when we come to structuralism and post-structuralism, I think it's important to understand the history that it carries with it. So let's assume that modern literary criticism, literary theory can be traced back to the Romantics. And I'm not simply talking about Wordsworth and Coleridge. I'm assuming that all of you are students of literature, English literature. Therefore, I'm just taking their examples, but there are many other writers who ask these questions. So what is literature? What does literature? How does literature convey knowledge? I'll give you another example, and this is across England to America. And we see a certain kind of a shift over there. So Wordsworth and Coleridge, remember, are late 18th century, early 19th century. So 1798 is Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Of course, it's revised in 1802, where the idea of the poet is introduced, etc. So let's take a kind of a jump across the sea. Almost at the same time, a bit later, you have Edgar Allan Poe in America. Now, what does Edgar Allan Poe has a very famous essay called The Art of Composition. Yeah. And what is he saying over there? It's again an interesting part of what we call structuralist, post-structuralist theory over here. Now, Poe says that there seems to be in any composition, any poetic composition, or any form of composition, literary composition, Poe says there is a unity of effect. That's the phrase that he uses. He says there is a unity of effect. But he adds an interesting thing to it. He says that this unity of effect is not simply something that the poet talks about or the poet deals with. The unity of effect, it is a unity because what the poet says is also interpreted by the reader in a certain way. And if there is a kind of a coalescing, a coming together of what the poet is saying and what the reader is interpreting, then he says this creates the unity of effect. Okay. Not going into details into this, what is he adding to the Romantic literary theory? The Romantic literary theory, remember, the poet is the central figure who can transfer ontological knowledge into epistemological knowledge, who can transfer the definition of literature to what the literature does in terms of knowledge production. Poet Edgar Allan Poe adds to it by saying that, well, let us also add the reader. The reader is also important because it's not simply what the poet writes, but it's also the reader who plays an important role in interpretation. Now, let's take another brief time jump. Edgar Allan Poe wrote in the 1830s and the 40s. So we start with 1798, 1830s, 40s, Edgar Allan Poe, an American writer. Now let's take another jump to 1870s and 1880s. When you have different schools of poetry. Again, I'm going to give you examples from English literature, but remember again, whenever you're doing literary theory or literary criticism, whenever you're reading about it, it's a good idea to keep in mind that there is a lot of continental influence on what we call English poetry. Okay. Now, if you're preparing for NET, then you know that there is something called the aesthetic school, the school of aestheticism, as it was called, late 19th century. And if you know the aesthetic school of poetry, it can be traced back to the pre-Raphaelites, for example, D.G. Rossetti, William Morris, etc. But of course, later during the aesthetic school of poetry, you have other writers who come up during this period. I'm sure that you know about them. And one of the important thing that aesthetic school of poetry did was it gave this very famous slogan called art for art's sake. And I'm sure that you know about that. What does it mean, art for art's sake? There are various interpretations of this, but I'll not go into the details again because we need to cover structuralism and post-structuralism. Now, art for art's sake, one of the things, now remember for the Romantics, who is at the center? The poet. For Edgar Allan Poe and later the symbolists, for example, what is at the center is both the poet and the reader. For the aesthetic school of poetry, one example of this, you had poets like Swinburne, for example. Art for art's sake shifts the focus to the text. So the literary text becomes central. Okay. So what they're basically saying is the literary text does not have any correlation with biographical, social, or historical. So literature is outside those domains. So literature creates its own reality. Literature creates its own world. And therefore, it does not really reflect. So there is this famous theory of mirror when we study literature, that literature is the mirror of the society. Now, I don't know who really gave that definition and how we came across this definition. I have not come across anyone who actually says that literature is the mirror of the society, but we kind of accept this general definition of literature. What the aesthetic school of poetry is doing is it's saying that it is not a mirror. Literature is self-contained. It is something that you really cannot relate to anything else. It creates its own reality. It creates its own world, self-contained world. So there is a third move by the end of the 19th century where the text becomes important. So the literary production, the production of a literary text is now removed both from the poet, the Romantics, and from the reader, the Edgar Allan Poe version of the story. Now, if you look at these three things which seem to be separate, so you have the Romantics, you have Edgar Allan Poe writing in America, and you have the aesthetic school of poetry coming after Wordsworth and Coleridge's death, late in the 19th century, 1870s and 1880s. There is a general commonality. Okay, so in all these three, you can see that there is something common. What is that common thing? The common thing is what I call the ontology of literature. So if you remember, the ontological question is, what is literature? Now, all three, the Romantics, Edgar Allan Poe, and the aesthetic school, seem to agree. They seem to disagree on the epistemology. They seem to disagree on what knowledge literature gives, or how is that knowledge produced, etc. But they seem to agree on one thing. And that one thing is that literature is something which is absolutely special. Okay, so Romantics agree on it. And therefore, Wordsworth and Coleridge can say that it can sway the masses, it can chase the masses. Shelley, Keats, remember, negative capability, etc. So literature is central. Edgar Allan Poe is also saying that. So there can be a unity of effect between the writer and the reader, and the literature has the power to change society. The aesthetic school is also saying the same, by saying that literature is something special. It can contain its own self-contained world. It is something which needs to be treated specially. Now, if we take another jump and come to the 1920s and 30s, leaving aside 1880s and 90s, that literature is something very special becomes the central idea of new criticism. So this is a school of criticism that starts developing around the 1920s. There are texts even before that. So what does new criticism do? It simply looks at literary texts as self-contained texts. Their belief is that literary texts have some special qualities. And because they have special qualities, as one of the new critics, John Crowe Ransom, said in a very famous essay called Literary Criticism Inc., Incorporated, INC, Literary Criticism Inc. Ransom very famously said that there are three kinds of people who interpret literature. One he called the philosopher. And Ransom said the task of the philosopher is to look at general ideas about literature. The task of the philosopher is not to look at specific literature and see what is happening in literature. The second kind of person who is interested in literature is a literary critic. Okay. What does the literary critic do? The literary critic looks at particular aspects of literature, of a poem or a short story or a novel, and then writes about it. And the third category, which you'll be interested to know that Ransom talked about, was a professor, especially a professor in the English department. And it is the task of the professor to guide the people to see how literature operates. So you can already see that new criticism is making a move, or the new critics, as they were called, people like I. Richards and William Empson, Ransom, Crowe, etc. They're already saying that literature, drawing from aesthetic school, that literature is something special and therefore needs to be treated specially. So critical analysis of literature has to be in a special way. And even if I'm sure that you have read Eliot, for example, Eliot contributed to new criticism in a big way with his ideas of objective correlative and dissociation of sensibility, etc. So these ideas that he gave, again, primarily evaluates a text based on the intrinsic capability of a text, that a text is all. You don't have to go outside the text to do anything. Okay. So you don't really, again, need to, it's almost art for art's sake in a critical form. Okay. So while art for art's sake writers were saying that art is only for art and there is no other greater value for art, greater goal of art, The new critics are saying the task of criticism is to concentrate only on the text, nothing beyond the text. And as critics like I.A. Richards pointed out, the task of the literary critic is to find out the truth in literature. And this is I.A. Richards in Practical Criticism, which was published in 1929. And in Practical Criticism, I.A. Richards points out that the task of the professional critic, the new critic, is to indicate what is true in literature, what is the truth that literature contains, etc. Uh, now, how do we take the jump to formalism? And this was the introductory part that I thought we should clear up before we go into formalism. Now, before we get into formalism, let's just get into the basic categories that new criticism gives, because there are a bit of carryovers from new criticism into formalism. So you really can't separate them in a big way, though there are massive differences between the two schools. So let me just list what is there in new criticism. The first, the first thing that new criticism believes is that there is no correlation between meaning and intention. For example, I may intend to do something, but it doesn't mean that it always has a correlated meaning, okay? Which the new critics call the intentional fallacy. For example, my intention, if I put it into a text that my intention is something, but I superimpose my intention onto the writer's intention, then I am misreading the text. Okay, because you have to find out the writer's intention, not my intention. And that is what they called intentional fallacy. So there is no correlation between the meaning of a text and the intention of the reader. Okay? First thing. The second thing they said was that meanings are always connotative in nature. Now, if you know the basic theory of linguistics, then there are two basic kinds of meanings. One is denotative, that is literal meaning, and a connotative meaning. A very quick example of this, imagine that a phone is ringing in someone's house and someone says in the house, the phone is ringing. Okay. So the denotative meaning is the phone is ringing because it is ringing. It's the literal meaning of the sentence. But that is not what the speaker means. The phone is ringing actually means that someone should go and pick up the phone. Yeah. So that is the connotative meaning, the extended. The new critics believe that connotative meanings are central to literature. Now, remember, the focus for new critics was mostly on poetry. They hardly dealt with novel or fictional forms. So their focus was primarily on poetry. So they said that all poetic forms, therefore, are connotative in nature, and there is always an excess to that connotation. Okay? So it's not that you can always find out what the connotation does, what is the extended meaning. But the task of the critic is to kind of find those excesses in connotation. What is left out? What is the parrot? What is the tension? For example, one of the terms that they used was tension in poetry. So what is the tension that poetry contains, etc. The third thing which new critics did was they promulgated a type of reading which they called close reading. So you read the text very closely, try to find out the different linguistic elements of the text, try to find out the different meaning containing elements of the text, try to find out the semiotic content of the text, and then try to approach or get to the meaning of the text. Okay, so the connotative meaning of the text. So you have to closely read the text, line by line, word by word, alphabet by alphabet, etc. The fourth thing, which the new critics did, was text is seen as anonymous. Anonymous in the sense the text does not have an author. Of course, there is an author to the text. You accept that author. So Shakespeare wrote something, Keats wrote something. But you don't allow the author to come into the text because your reading of the text is based on the text itself. You don't go into the biography of the author. You don't go into the historical context of the author, etc. Excuse me. So texts are anonymous in nature, and therefore, what you can do when you are close reading a text is you can think of a persona of the text. Okay? So it's not essentially the poet who is writing, but there is a persona. Okay, and therefore you had these distinctions between implied readers of texts, uh, implied speakers of text, etc. Okay, so it's not that the poet is always the implied speaker of a text. That's the fourth thing that they did. The fifth thing, and these are categories that they gave, is that poetry, any kind of poetry, needs to be understood through what they called complexity, irony, one of the categories that they use to understand poetry, ambiguity. So if you look at William Empson's 7 types of ambiguity, tension, paradox. So all these categories are to be used to understand poetry as such. So poetry contains these categories, and the task of the critic is to unveil, to open up poetry and see how irony works in poetry, or paradox works in poetry, or tension works in poetry, etc. Now, one of the things that new critics were very interested in is that, and this is the last thing, and I'm going to move to formalism now, is that most of their works, so if you look at the entire tradition of new criticism, and most of their works were based on individual works of art. Okay. So mostly individual poets or a group of poems that people have taken. So people would work on Keats, for example, or people would work on Shelley or Wordsworth or Coleridge or whatever. But there was never a general theory of literature. So they were not very concerned about what is literature. So they were not very concerned about, if you remember, ontology. Nor were they very concerned about the epistemology of literature. So how does literature produce knowledge? They were not very concerned about these things at all. They were more concerned about an interpretive technique that can be used to study literature. That was the major concern of new criticism. Now let's move on. And by the 1940s and 50s, when new criticism, remember, was a very, very powerful school, and it traveled across continents. So it started in America, traveled to UK, to other European nations, and then was, because English literature was taught in all the colonies in India and other imperial British colonies, new criticism became a very useful tool to teach literature. And it came in big waves, especially in the 40s and the 50s, to many English departments across the world, and became one of the most popular methods of teaching literature. So you close read a text, you try to find out what the text does, etc. But by the 1950s, and I'll just mention this, there was quite a lot of criticism of new criticism. Okay, it had already started in America, but later it started spreading across. One of the earliest criticisms of new criticism was from what is known as the Chicago School of Criticism. It is also sometimes known as the New Aristotelian School of Criticism. And you have people like R.S. Crane, C-R-A-N-E, um, Emil Olson, then or Robert McCann, etc. So let me just tell you briefly about R.S. Crane and the Chicago School of Criticism and what were they objecting against in new criticism. Now, the Chicago School said that one of the problems of new criticism is that they are focused on individual texts and interpreting individual texts through all these categories, if you remember: complexity, tension, paradox, irony, etc. But they do not talk about the genre of literature, because literature also operates through genres. For example, if you're writing a lyric, or if you're writing an ode, or if you're writing an epic, so they belong to certain genres. But new critics have nothing to say about those genres, because the moment you pick up a genre, for example, if you say that I'm going to write a novel, now novel over a period of years, historically speaking, has developed certain characteristics. That it should have a plot, it should have characters, it should have a storyline, etc. So there are certain characteristics that are there in the novel itself. But the new critics were never bothered about this historical genre formation. Okay. They were more concerned about individual texts of literature as if they had no history at all. Okay. So the Chicago School critics pointed out that one of the problems of new criticism is that it completely erases history. It completely does away with any sense of how a genre also determines what a poem is, how a genre also determines, for example, why is Wordsworth writing lyrics? I mean, he could have written anything else, though he claims that he's writing something new in a new language through the voice of a new poet. But why is he choosing lyrics in that sense? So why is Keats choosing sonnets? Because the genre is available to them historically, and they're doing something to that genre historically, okay, in their particular context. And in order to understand a poem, Chicago School argued, you need to understand the implications of genre for understanding literature. This is the first criticism that Chicago School came up with. The second thing that Chicago School pointed out is that new critics seem to be obsessed with poetry. Because, see, if you're doing a close reading of a text, it's more easy to do for a poem. Even if it is a long poem, it will not be more than, let's say, 10 pages or 20 pages. But the moment you take new criticism to novels, let's say you are doing a close reading of Don Quixote, or if you're doing a close reading of Pilgrim's Progress, will this theory stand? So the problem with new criticism is that it might be suited for poetry reading, but for other genres of literature, because they do not really talk about genre as such, it is not very applicable, because the moment you start doing close reading of novels, etc., it becomes more difficult to do a close reading of a novel, okay? Because novels are generally long. Remember, in the early 20th century, novels were generally very, very big. And does this theory then stand scrutiny when you apply it to a novel? This is the second thing that Chicago School pointed out. And if you're interested in Chicago School, there is a book called Critics and Criticism, which they published in 1952. So please do look that up and see what their point of view was. The second criticism of new critics, again in the 1950s, comes from development of a certain kind of psychoanalytic criticism by Northrop Frye, which all of you are aware is known as archetypal criticism. And what is Frye's objection to new criticism? I'll again very quickly go through it. And if you're interested, please do read Frye. Now, Frye says that the task of literary criticism or theory or critical theory or whatever you want to call it is not to just look at one particular aspect of literature. But the task of criticism or theory is to provide an overall theory of literature. So it's not simply about poetry or novel or drama. What the task of criticism is to provide a kind of a unified theory of literature. And Fry tried to do it through his archetypal criticism. And what he did, and I'm sure that you know about this, is that he looked at these cluster of symbols that travel across literature, across continents, across history, and are repeated in different ways in different forms of literature. The important thing that Fry pointed out towards is that literature as a category, as an ontology, what is literature? And Fry, in the very opening of his book, points out that literature seems to have a universal structure. And that universal structure seems to, in different permutations and combinations, seem to occur across cultures, across historical spaces, across continents, etc. So it seems that there is a kind of a structure that operates across genres, novels, poetry, etc., universal. So literature seems to possess that structure, and that structure is repeated over a period of time. And this can be seen as the beginning of structuralism in a certain sense. But before we come to structuralism, let's take a detour through formalism. Now, formalism, or Russian formalism as it is sometimes called, what are the central concepts over there? Now, again, I'm not giving you names, but there are quite a few. And there is a bit of a debate whom to include. For example, is Mikhail Bakhtin a part of formalist school? Is he not? Etc. But if you look at the Russian formalists and the basic theory of literature that they are giving, remember the idea again is to give a unified theory of literature, just like Northrop Frye. So one of the central idea of formalism is defamiliarization. What is defamiliarization? The idea is to say that literature produces something, any literature, that takes you away from your immediate social, historical, economic, cultural forms. Okay. So it defamiliarizes it. In other words, it reinterprets, revisualizes, reinscribes the world that you live in. So you might be living in a certain social, cultural, historical, economic world. What literature does is it completely reinterprets it in such a way that it defamiliarizes it. You see the world differently in a completely defamiliarized fashion. How do they do it? So how do literary authors defamiliarize the world for you? And remember, the Russian formalists were extremely interested in fiction, novel, any form of fiction in that sense. So they said that they agreed with Fry that there is a structure to literature. And this structure can be divided into two basic parts. Okay. So any literary structure, any literary piece will carry what they called a sujet, the subject, the content, and the fabula, the plot. Yeah. So you have two parts to that structure. So you have the sujet and the fabula. What do they do? So if we simply translate it, it's simply form and content. Okay. So you have the form of the structure. So for example, any structure will have a form. It's spherical or cylindrical or rectangular. And then it contains something. So literature also contains something within it. Now, the formalists argued that it often so happens that the form and the content are kind of interdependent. You really can't separate them. Okay. So, for example, when you're reading a novel, the form of the novel also determines the way the content is organized. Just like the content of the novel also determines the form. So they're kind of interrelated. So the form and the content, the sujet and the fabula, will have to be brought together in order to understand literature. Otherwise, you can't understand it. In practical terms, what does this mean? Let me give you an example. So Mikhail Bakhtin, when he was studying the novel form, the form of the novel, he said there are two aspects to studying the form of the novel. One is the historical aspect, which he called the diachronic aspect. What is the historical aspect of the novel? So what Bakhtin did was he, even before the first so-called novel was written, let's say if we take Don Quixote as one of the first novels, Bakhtin said that let's even go further back. So for example, let's look at Rabelais' writings. Okay. Rabelais was a priest who wrote different kinds of things. So he went back to those kind of forms which were prose in nature and tried to see what was really happening over there. So I'll very quickly go through Bakhtin to make you understand what is formalism in terms of sujet and fabula. So I'll just point out three things that Bakhtin pointed out. One, that the beginnings or historical beginnings of novel seem to be dependent on earlier forms of prose writings. And these prose writings originally were produced in places which created subversion. Okay? So they had a subversive element in it. Remember, any kind of a prose during the 11th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries was supposed to be mostly didactic, religious in nature. Okay? But this is not where the novel begins. Novel begins in more non-didactic kinds of prose. Prose which is subversive, which makes fun of others, which ironicizes things, which creates, which makes fun of others. It's satirical in nature. So it is in this kind of prose that the novel first has its birth. The second thing he points out is that, again, about the form of the novel, that because you could not say anything against a certain kind of prose, for example, religious prose, you could not directly attack it. So what you needed was you needed spaces, certain spaces where you could say things against the official doctrine. Now remember, you could, even in those spaces, you could not always directly attack, for example, the Pope or the clergy. So what you needed to do, therefore, is to invent a kind of writing that would contain a double voice, it almost like a parody. So you kind of mimic the official discourse, but at the same time, you satirize it. This Bakhtin called dialogic imagination. So there was a possibility of subversion within that dialogue. So it was like two voices speaking at the same time. Okay, it's a double voiced production, the novel. Okay. So it contains, on the surface, the official line, you're not hurting anyone, but underneath it has this subversion, which is double voiced. This is the second thing he pointed out about the form of the novel. He said only with this double voicing, that is, only with this dialogic form, that novel could come into existence. And the third thing that he pointed out about the novel is that this form, then now, once the religious, or let's say in the medieval Europe, for example, when slowly the church is not so more powerful during the Renaissance and the Reformation, etc., this form that is now available can now be filled with different kinds of content, which may not be religious in nature at all. Okay? So the novel becomes much more secularized in that sense. So it does not have any religious content, and it is with this move, Don Quixote, remember, doesn't talk about, I mean, talks about religion, but not in that sense. That you have the birth of the novel. So what happens is you have the form of the novel, which has a historical space, but you also have the content that becomes much more secularized as the novel progresses in that sense. Now, this is basically what formalism does. But one of the central things that we have seen in our discussion so far is that, right from Northrop Frye, if you remember the idea of the structure of literature, to formalism as the structure of literature again, to the example that I gave you about Bakhtin, about the structure of the novel, structure becomes an important part. So what is the structure of literature? That is the question that we will look at now, and then look at structuralism and post-structuralism. I'll just introduce the beginnings, and then I'll stop for 5 minutes if you have any questions, and then we'll move on. In 1916, actually in 1914, a person who had nothing to do with literature, who was a linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure, gave a series of lectures in the University of Geneva. Okay. The lectures were based on his understanding of language. What was he saying in those lectures? Remember, he was just giving lectures, a series of lectures. He was doing a summer school in the University of Geneva, and he gave those lectures. Saussure died in, if I'm not wrong, 1916. And the students who were there in those lectures, they thought that what he was saying was something revolutionary. It was a complete reinterpretation of how people looked at language. So these students got together and compared their notes. They had taken notes during his lectures and then put together those notes in the form of a book. The book was called A Course in General Linguistics. Though it was published by the name of Saussure himself, as a kind of a tribute by his students to their teacher. What is Saussure saying in this book? Or what was he saying in those lectures? He was saying that linguistics till now, linguistics as the study of languages, has been dependent on one thing. The kind of linguistics that was practiced during Saussure's time, remember early 20th century, was historical comparative linguistics and philology. These are the two kinds of linguistics that was practiced. What is historical comparative linguistics? Excuse me. Historical comparative linguistics looked at the history of languages and compared them with other languages. For example, I can look at the history of Gujarati right from the beginning, look at the different kinds of linguistic forms that Gujarati has come through, and then can compare Gujarati with the history of Marathi, history of Bengali, etc. So then you compare languages. And that was the major form of linguistics that used to be done. Philology was basically a study of words. So you looked at different kinds of words that are there in languages and then tried to see how they are related in family forms. For example, all of you know that the Sanskrit word for mother is matra. When it goes to France, into French, it becomes maître. In German, it becomes Mutter. In English, it becomes mother, etc. So people study these traveling of words across historical periods. That is what linguistics primarily did. So historical comparative or philology. Saussure said that the task of linguistics should not be this. I mean, people can do historical comparative, it's an important branch of study. But the task of linguistics is to show how language operates now. What is happening to language now? And in order to do that, how do you understand language? Till now, language has been understood either as a part of a historical family of languages. For example, you have in Roman, you have Roman, and from Roman languages, you have Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and from French, you have other forms of dialectal forms coming out. From Spanish, you have Basque and Barcelonian, etc. Et so you look at family trees. So the first question that Saussure asked is, how do you define language? And he said that language can be understood as a system of signs, S-I-G-N-S, signs. Okay. So we have to understand language as signs. So they contain something which tell us something. Okay. So it contains sounds, words, alphabets, etc. Now these signs, Saussure would say, has two parts. One he called the signifier, the other he called the signified. I'm not going to go into the details because I'm sure that all of you know about this. The signifier, of course, is the acoustic component, the word as it is pronounced. For example, the letter A is pronounced as or a or o, etc. Or how it is written as a grapheme. But there is another part attached to it, and that is the signified. The signified is the meaning component of the word or the letter or the alphabet, etc. So you have the sound or the written component, and you have the meaning component. So you have the signifier and the signified. Now, Saussure said the signifier and signified will have to be together. So you cannot have a signifier without a signified, and you cannot have a signified without a signifier. So it's like two sides of the same coin. So you cannot have a coin until you have both signified and signified. This is his basic idea of the sign. He said this sign has three basic qualities or properties, attributes. The first is that when I call a tree in English, a tree, there is no natural quality in the object that produces the word. I'll try to explain this. For example, there is no treeness in a tree. that makes me say that I will call this object a tree. It's just a random selection. It's arbitrary in that sense. So there is an arbitrary relation between the word and the object that it denotes. So the word is, let's say, tree, and the object that it denotes can be of different types of trees. But what I do is I assign a sign to an object. Okay, so there is tree, and then I say, okay, this object is a tree. But this is not a universal phenomenon because, of course, the word tree in English is not the same for every language. So we have different words for the same object. Okay. So this is an arbitrary relationship. So the word and its meaning seem to have an arbitrary relationship between each other. The second thing is, why do we accept it? Why do we call a tree a tree? So Saussure said this is the second attribute of a sign, and that is that all signs are conventional in nature. So therefore, meanings change. So you accept over a period of time that this word means this, and then you start learning the language and you start using it in a certain way, and you get kind of socialized into language. Okay? You become a part of the social world of language. And then you say, okay, this word for this object is this, and therefore I'm going to use this word. Okay, but this is absolutely conventional because history of languages has shown us that meanings change, the way people use words change, etc. The third thing that Saussure said, that this third attribute that the sign has, is that there is no positive relation between the signifier and the signified. I'll try to explain this a bit. What does he mean by positive relationship? So it's not that the moment you produce the word tree, you immediately see the object. The meaning of the word is reached because the word tree is different from many other words that you know in English. For example, it is different from the word free or sea, etc. Okay. So the meaning that you get to when someone says the word cat or tree or dog is not by a positive identification of an object. Because the moment people talk to you, when I'm talking to you, I'm sure that you understand what I'm saying when I say a tree, though you don't see a tree in front of you. When I say a word cat, you don't really need a cat in front of you to understand the word. You understand what I'm saying when I say the word cat, etc. Though you might be thinking of different kinds of cats. So there is no positive identification between the word and the object that is there outside. The relationship between the signifier, the word free, and the signified, Saussure pointed out, is that of a difference. So there is because the word dog or cat or tree is different from other words, it leads you to a certain kind of a meaning. Okay, so you know that dog is different from fog and log and jog, etc. And it is through this differentiation, this relationship of differences, that you reach the meaning of the word. Now, why do you think is this revolutionary? So why did the students think that this is a revolutionary thinking? What he is saying is absolutely new. I'll just give you the three attributes. So the first thing that Saussure arbitrarily remembered is that there is no universal system of the science. Science are absolutely arbitrary. So there is nothing called natural language. Language is something that is created by humans, is absolutely arbitrary in nature. The second attribute, if you remember, he called is that it is conventional. So it is located in history, it is located in a society, in a cultural formation. So society, culture, history, the context in which people live have a major impact on how people use language. And the third thing, that there is no positive meaning that the language leads you to, that language is a system that is self-contained. So the meaning of the word is not because you see an object, but because the words themselves produce the meanings through differences. basically says that there is no relation between language and reality. So it's even when I say the word cat, even if you don't have a cat in front of you, you understand the word because the linguistic system tells you to. Okay. So there is no relation between the word cat and then you have to wait for the cat to appear to understand what it means. So there is no relationship, direct relationship between language and reality. Okay. Now, if this is so, and this is the basis of structuralism, how do you apply structuralism to literary theory? And this is the beginning of what we call literary theory. I'll just stop over here for 2-3 minutes. If you have any clarifications or questions, we'll take them. And then we'll move on to literary criticism.
In,
Ye- Yes,
spend
please
one or
go.
Sorry,
two
I
minutes
think I
for
saw a
signifier
chat.
and signified, because uh, that will come later. Hello, Heli. The difference between criticism and theory will come later. Uh, but I have to ask them whether they understood signifier and signified, because they have no formalism or structuralism in their syllabus.
Oh, you don't
Have you
know?
understood the meaning of signifier and signified? First thing.
Yes, sir.
So
Okay,
I'll just
thank you.
see the messages. There are a few messages. So what is the difference between criticism and theory? So we'll come to that. Just as we start with structuralism, I'll begin with that in the next phase. Is the practice of calling speaker of the poem rather than the poet derives from new criticism? Partly, yes, because new criticism, as I told you, talked about the persona of the poet rather than the poet himself, because they would say that there is, we don't really know what the poet thought. So we have to assume that there is an implied speaker, and that implied speaker is speaking. So that is why it's more, that's why I use the word narrator now. We don't use the word the author or poet, etc. Could you go over the point of Bakhtin? Okay. So very quickly, Bakhtin is saying, is that in order to understand, so I was using Bakhtin to make you understand formalism. So formalism says that any literature has a form and a content, a chose and a fabula. So what Bakhtin shows you is that novel has a form. Okay? The form derives historically. So it derives from, for example, subversive literature written during the Middle Ages, which was written in prose, but it had two voices. So one was the official religious voice, but of course there was a subversive voice underneath, making fun of the official religious discourse. The name that he gives to this is carnivalesque. So there used to be this massive carnivals where the same priests who used to teach the Bible and the religious discourses of the church would actually come and act as a clown. Okay, so this double voicing was possible only through this thing. So that was the part of the form. The content of the novel became, so the moment it moved away from religious discourses to more secular forms of discourses, which were non-religious in that nature, the content of the form kept on getting supplied. So your everyday naive. So if you look at Don Quixote, so this man who goes out in the search of a fantasy, or if you look at Robinson Crusoe in English literature, so you of course will have religion in the text, but it's not a religious text anymore. So you move out. So the content becomes your life, the world that you see around you, and that can come into prose. So that is what Bakhtin did. So you have the form of the novel, but also the content of the novel, which are kind of interrelated to each other. So you cannot really separate them in that sense. Okay, the third one is, I hope this made sense. I think Bharvi asked this question. Drashti says Ransom gives three kinds of people who interpret literature: philosophy, professor. Third one is the literary critic, the critic a professional critic. So that's the third one. Let me see, there is one more message. Okay. Any other question? If you have any question on Saussure, because we are going to base our structuralism, post-structuralism in the next 45 minutes or so on Saussure's ideas.
By Jaimin Joshi.
Jamin, I can't see him. Acho, this is, can you explain why it is doing theory rather than applying theory? So that's the difference between, so it's a good point to start with actually. So that's one of the basic differences between literary criticism and literary theory. So let's begin with that. And if you have any questions, please drop in questions on the chat box. So when you do criticism, if you remember when we were discussing new criticism, they give you a format. Okay. For example, poetry contains irony, paradox, complexity. You take that format and then apply it to a poem. Okay. So that is how criticism is supposed to be done. Or if you take even T.S. Eliot. So he talks about objective correlative, he talks about dissociation of sensibility, and then you look at poets or where this dissociation happens. So there is a ready-made framework that is available to you. That's why you apply critical understanding or critical frameworks to a literary text in order to interpret the literary text. When you come into the domain of literary theory, which we'll begin with now, with structuralism and post-structuralism, the first thing I must tell you is that the major literary theorists that we study in our syllabi have nothing to do with literature. They're not literature person at all. Okay. The famous five, which everyone talks about, only one of them actually deals with literature. But before we come to them, let me make this, it's a very difficult distinction to make, but let me make this distinction between how do we move from literary criticism, like Plato, Aristotle, Horace Longinus, to literary theory. Now, this will take us back to the original question that I asked. So what is literature? And what kind of knowledge does literature produce? Or what knowledge will be, or what is the process of knowledge production? That is the epistemological question and the ontological question. Now, when you come to literary theory, the focus is more on the ontological question. Okay. So the question is more on what is literature? So how do you define literature? But then the second assumption in theory is that there is not much, you really can't separate ontology and epistemology. Okay. So you cannot really separate the question, what is literature and what kind of knowledge does literature produce? Because they are interrelated. Because the way you define literature will also define the kind of knowledge that literature produces. For example, if I define literature as romantics did, as, or the poet, for example, a man speaking to men. Okay. Or if you remember Wordsworth's famous definition of poetry, of spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility, he defines literature as this treasure house of emotions that can be recollected and then told to people. So at the same time, if you look at Wordsworth, he's not simply defining literature. He's also telling you the knowledge that needs to be drawn from literature. Okay? The knowledge of nature, the knowledge of the rustic life, the knowledge of people's languages, etc., etc. So one of the important things that happens after Saussure, after structuralism, is that you cannot really separate the definition or the way you define literature and the way that definition produces a certain kind of knowledge. So theory, what we call literary theory, is more interested into these intersections of what we separate as ontology and epistemology. So what something is and what something produces in the form of knowledge. So literary theory brings them into contact with each other. They are not separate. So we'll keep this in mind. The second thing that literary theory does post Saussure of signifier and signified, especially in structuralism, is that it looks at, if you remember, we talked about structure of literature, Northrop Frye, formalism, etc. There's a belief that texts have a structure. And the task of the literary critic, therefore, is to find out the structures of a text and how those structures kind of relate to each other. It is not very different, remember, from new criticism, early kinds of structuralism. Okay. But there is a major difference. The assumption over here is not that the text is self-contained. The assumption over here that the relationship between the different kinds of structures that the text has also tells us the non-meaning that the text has. So it's not possible for me to understand everything that the text says. It's impossible for me. Okay? What I can simply show is the relationship that exists in a text between the signifier and the signified and how they relate to each other in different ways. I'll give you a very concrete example of this. So I'm just writing in the chat box, this name. Now, this Russian gentleman called Vladimir Prop in 1929, if I'm not wrong, wrote this famous book called The Morphology of a Russian Folktale. What does Prop do in the text? He looked at all the Russian folktales that are available. And then he realized that all these folktales seem to repeat certain things. If you remember Northrop Frye, so the story pattern seems to be repeated. So he made a list of those repetitions. He called them functions. So he said that these functions are absolutely important for any Russian folktale. He actually identified 31 functions of a Russian folktale. So it begins, for example, with an absence. For example, the hero is missing, or the princess is missing. So someone is missing. Okay. The second function is interdiction. So someone takes some step to find the hero. The third function is the appearance or disappearance of a villain. So there will be a villain who comes in and tries to stop what the hero is doing, etc. So there are 31 functions like this. What Prop claimed is that it has been proved wrong now, but at that time it was very powerfully claimed that the 31 functions that he gave always follow the same structure. For example, it will always begin with number 1 In some folk tales, number 2 might be missing, number 3 might be missing, but you can never have a folk tale which starts with number 4. If it starts with number 4, it cannot go back to number 1. So there is no change in that structure. So number 1 to 31 will always have a straight line progression. Some of the functions might be missing. For example, from number 1 function, you can go to number 5, the number 7, number 9, etc. But it will never be 9, 7, 3, 2. It will never go in a reverse direction. You cannot have a permutation combination. The functions are always in a progressive line. Okay. Based on these 31 functions, and this is one of the classic structuralist study, Propp said that these functions are based on what he called actants. I'll just write the word in the chat again. What are these actants? So the 7, he said there are 7 actants in a folktale. So along with the 31 functions. And these 7 actants were, and you will find it in the book itself, it's called Morphology of the Russian Folktale. So you had actants are people who act. So people who carry out the action of the story. So you had hero, you had a villain, you had false hero, you had donor, you had prize, you had the dispatcher. So there are these 7 actants in a story. And there's always a kind of a structural relationship between, so hero and the villain will have a structural relationship of antagonism. Okay. Hero and the help will have a structural relationship of help, of friendship. Hero and the prize, the hero might receive the prize, might not receive the prize. The prize is generally, in most of the folk tales, the princess. So the hero and the prize have a relationship of desire. Okay. So the hero desires the prize. The hero and the dispatcher have a relationship again of antagonism. So all these actants are structurally related to each other through different kinds of relationships. Okay. Now, what structuralism therefore did was something very interesting. They looked at not simply texts as containing preconceived notions of irony, tension, paradox, etc. What it was basically interested in was to look at how the structure of a text produces different sorts of meanings. I'll give you one more example, and you must read this very short essay, not a very short essay, but more or less readable essay by, I'll just write the name again over here. His name is Zetwan Todorov. Todorov has a very interesting essay on detective fiction. If you're interested in detective fiction, this would be a good essay to read and a good example of structuralism. Now, Todorov says that detective fiction itself has a very interesting structure across. If you have read detective fiction, you know. And the structure is that of what he calls continuous desires. So, for example, at the beginning of the story, the detective is bored, he has nothing to do. Generally, he or she, someone comes with a mystery, so you have a desire to solve the mystery. Then there are, stoppages, blockages to solve that mystery. And then finally, the mystery is either solved or not solved or left open. Okay. And this structure is repeated not only in English detective fiction, but across detective fiction across the world. And Todorov made an interesting observation. He said that this seems to produce what he called genre fiction. So the idea of genre fiction, of fiction that is based generically. Okay, for example, if you think of writings like science fiction or detective fiction or crime fiction or horror fiction, they follow a certain kind of a formula, okay, which is repeated again and again and again. Okay, but people still keep on reading it, primarily because they love anticipating the structure of the fountain. Okay. And this is what structuralism primarily did. But before we end, and I mentioned the famous five of structuralism and post-structuralism, I don't know how many of them actually would say that we are structuralists or post-structuralists. They're all from France. These are Roland Barthes, who is the only literary theorist over here. The second is Michel Foucault. The third one is Jacques Lacan. He's a psychoanalyst. Foucault is a historian. You have Derrida, who is more of a post-structuralist than structuralist. And you have Claude Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss definitely is structuralist, but Lévi-Strauss studied literature, but he was an anthropologist. So I'll repeat the names again. So you have Roland Barthes, you have Claude Lévi-Strauss, an anthropologist, you have Michel Foucault, a historian, you have Jacques Lacan, a psychoanalyst, and Jacques Derrida, who is a philosopher. He's a professor, he was a professor of philosophy. Now, these five kind of shaped what we call structuralism and post-structuralism. Of course, there are many other people who contributed. We'll not go into them, because there was American school of structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, etc. So very quickly, we'll go through them to understand what are they saying. Now, Barthes, it's very difficult to, again, when we talk about these five, to call them structuralists and post-structuralists. So I'll call them both, because in different phases of their writings, they move from structuralism to post-structuralism. So if you read early essays by Roland Barthes, then they're definitely much more structuralist. But then later Barthes is not that structuralist anymore. And I'll try to tell you the differences between what is structuralism and what is post-structuralism. So let's take the example of Barthes. And I'll give you the example that Barthes gave. So Barthes wrote a book called Mythologies in, I think, 1955, maybe 54. In Mythologies, Barthes looks at myths of modern times. So he looks at food, for example, music, etc. And he discusses a very interesting picture. And the picture is of a black soldier in a French army uniform, a black soldier, a French army uniform, saluting the national flag of France. And that's it. So it's a black soldier with a French army uniform saluting the national flag. And Barthes says that if you look at this picture, and it was a very common picture during the 1950s, it was very commonly used across France. He says the literal meaning of this, the literal structure of this, if you look at the signs as there, so you have a black person with a French army uniform saluting the national flag. It seems a very innocent picture. But then what is the structure of this picture? And Barthes says that it's interesting that if you look at the different kinds of signs that are encoded, he uses different kinds of words. So one of the words that he uses is encoding of signs. Is that on the one hand, historically speaking, France rules over Algeria, okay, the North African country, and it's brutal in its ruling. So Algeria was a part of France till its independence, where black, mostly men, are tortured, killed all the time. On the other hand, to indicate the French nation, you show a black man saluting the flag. So what is it saying in that sense? So what are the different kinds of science systems that are encoded over here? You must read that essay on this thing. I'll just give you 3 points from that essay. One is the encoding itself assumes that people will recognize the signs. For example, the people will recognize the French army uniform. People will recognize the salute of an army officer. So these are visible signs that people will recognize. People will recognize the French flag. So this is one layer of the structure of meanings. So you have an army officer with an army uniform saluting the national flag. The second layer of meaning is somewhere else, because they are not contained in the picture itself. So if you remember Saussure's idea of difference, those signs over there can have meaning only when they are placed in context with other kinds of signs that are there. So what is the structure of difference in this picture? It's interesting that the picture has a black man in an army uniform. But we also know historically the black men are constantly brutalized in Algeria. Okay? So you have that structure of sign as a difference. We also know that there is a whole history of slavery that has happened in the United States, and there are pictures of, the white supremacist organization called Ku Klux Klan beating up, burning black people, etc. So what happens if you place this picture, take this picture out, and then place them with images of differences? For example, if you place this picture with a white army officer beating up a black man in Algeria, or if you place this picture with a Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist organization, burning a black man in 19th century America, does the meaning of the picture change? It obviously changes, because now it creates a different sense of difference, because now the difference is with other visual elements. And Barth said, and this was the second thing, is that structures are not self-contained. So it's not that you just look at one picture and try to understand the meaning. They have a network of differences, and you need to look at those network of differences in order to understand the second layer of encoding. And the third layer of encoding that Barth pointed out is that why have a black man wearing a French army uniform saluting the French flag, when at the same time the French government is brutalizing black men in Algeria? So it contains another layer of differences of sign. Okay? So you don't have a white man saluting the flag. So now you are saying that as long as you are loyal to the French flag, then you are most welcome as a black man. But if you say anything against the French flag, like the revolutionaries in Algeria were doing, people who were fighting for the independence movement in Algeria was at its peak at that point of time, where a large number of black men participated. If you are saying anything against the French national flag, then you will not be included in this picture. So the framing of the picture itself contains a huge amount of what he called ideology. So there is an ideological representation of the black man saluting the French flag. So as long as you are a patriot and you respect the French flag, you are fine. If you're not, then we have other measures to do it. Okay. What are those other measures? And let's come to another structuralist before we move on to post-structuralism, because we are running out of time now. So any kind of so this is a picture, but think of a state. Think of a state in the sense of a nation or a national state. So if you do something wrong, the state can put you into prison. There are law courts. There is military to make sure that the borders of the state are not infringed upon. So let's call them what as repressive state apparatus. So state has certain instruments that can make sure that you follow the rule, that you follow the law. That's one of the structures of the state. So for example, I violate a traffic light, I have to pay a fine. I go and kill someone, then I have to go to the prison. And of course, there is judiciary, etc. So these are major structures of the state to make sure that everyone follows the rule. But the problem is not that. The problem is that not everyone does follow the rule. Okay. So you need what is known as the self-disciplinary mechanism. So you will have to be told constantly that please follow, like the black man, please respect the national flag. If you don't, then we have other measures. But then you cannot keep on beating people up with that stick. Okay. So there are other structures of the state that operate in a different way. For example, education, okay, or the idea of the family. So education is supposed to build the ideal citizen out of you, okay, and that then of course there are state apparatuses to make sure that you follow those rules. But that is not something that you want to use excessively. The ideal citizen is that which follows the structures of the state without even realizing that they are following the structures of the state. It is almost there unconsciously. Okay? So right from your childhood, an education pattern is built up in a certain way where you have to follow certain rules, you have to do certain things, you have to, whatever, give exams. So this is almost inbuilt within you. And these are almost invisible structures. We can call them ideological state apparatuses. Now, these are not my terms. This is by someone called Louis Althusser, who is another important figure in structuralism. What is Althusser saying? Althusser has nothing to do with literature. Althusser is saying, if you are looking at, Barthes is looking at literature or paintings or photographs as literature, as a structure of literature. Althusser is saying the same Saussurean logic can be placed not simply for literature, it can be used for state apparatuses, how the state functions, what is the structure of the state itself. So the structure of the state can be both ideological state apparatuses, for example, through education, through ideas of family, etc., or through repressive state apparatuses, where you can tell you that I have police, I have judiciary, I have this, that, etc. I can repress you. In other words, the Saussurean structure is not limited only to literature. The Saussurean structure of the science system, and Saussure actually said this in his course on general linguistics. He said, instead of calling it linguistics, we should call it what he called semiology. So, which is what is happening? So structures are not simply limited to literature. Remember, now we are moving away from new criticism. We are now moving away from formalism, which is completely concentrated on literature. The Saussurean structuralism, which was basically about language, tells you that structures are not simply part of literary disciplines. Structures can be a part of a state, it can be a part of history, it can be a part of how communities live, it can be a part of myths, it can be a part of kinship, and therefore structuralism can be used to understand not only literature, but also other aspects of the society that you live in. Because until and unless these structures are understood, you will not be able to understand literature at all, because these are also structures. You have structures of society, you have structures of history, you have structures of state, you have structures of your consciousness. Until unless you understand them. And the differences, remember the Saussurean theory of difference, that these structures have meaning only through differences. Only then will you be able to understand literature in a certain way. Or you can start with literature and then look at the other structures that operate around literature. And it is through these differences that meanings emerge. So how is therefore structuralism different from the other forms of literary criticism or literary theory that we have looked at? The first thing that structuralism accepts is that everything can be a sign. As Saussure said, that semiology is a study of the meaning of the sign system. Okay. So everything can be seen as a sign. So it's not simply that you need to have a written text or need to have an oral text to have a sign. So even a visual text can be a sign. And because it opens up then the possibility. Remember, literary criticism for a very long time was literature criticism. You just had to do printed literature. That's it. What structuralism also therefore did was opened up the possibility of looking at other science systems like historical science systems like visual science systems. In fact, Saussure once gave an example of traffic lights as science systems, because you accept that there is a signifier and signified in a traffic light. Therefore, conventionally, you accept that when it is red, we should stop, when it is green, we should go, etc. So it expands, it makes the field of literature much more interdisciplinary. So it's not that literature is something which is exalted, elevated, and contains a world within itself, but literature is a part of the larger science systems of the world. Okay? That is one of the contributions of structuralism. So let me get to post-structuralism and then I'll stop again. So next 10 minutes, because it's a bit more complicated. But let me just tell you very briefly, how does post-structuralism differ from structuralism? And I'll use the most famous post-structuralist, sometimes called a postmodernist, Derrida's argument. So Derrida, and it's a complex argument. So I'll try to make it in 3-4 sentences. The first thing is that if you have a structure, okay, let's say that you have a circle. So a circle is a structure, right? In order to have a circle, you have to assume that there is a center to the circle, right? So until unless the circle has a center, you cannot have a circle. So it is generally assumed that a structure is formed because there is a relationship between signifier and signified. And there are different kinds of signifiers and signifieds that produce a relationship. And the assumption is that all these signifier and signifiers produce meanings which are central to any kind of a structure. So the meaning production happens because a signifier leads to signified, another signifier leads to another signified, and then it produces meanings, which then contains this central meaning of the text. That's what we have been told, right? That the text contains a central meaning. So, and I'm sure that you must have answered questions in your class that what is the theme of the text? What is the central idea of the poem, etc. So there is an assumption that there is a center to the entire structure of a text. Now, if there is a center to the structure of the text, then that center should also have a structure. Okay, so what is the structure of that center? Now we have talked about the, I'm sure that you have seen questions like, what is the central idea of this poem? Or what is the, so when we ask this question, we are assuming there is something called a center. So is the center a part of the structure, or is it not a part of the structure? I'll give you another example of this. But before I give you that example, if the center is a part of the structure, then it is a part of the relationship of difference. Because signifier is different from another signifier, a signified is different from another signified, etc. But if center is part of that signified differences, then it cannot be the center. It has to be outside that structure to produce that meaning. Now I'll give you this example. In medieval theology in Europe, the world is constructed. I'm sure that you have read Milton, right? Paradise Lost. And you must have read that Milton's Paradise Lost is based on this pre-Ptolemaic vision of the earth. So remember, it was before Ptolemy came in and told that it is not the earth which is at the center of the universe, it's the sun around which the earth goes round. The general belief was that the earth is at the center of the universe because the God has created it. And all meanings on earth, therefore, are given by God. To make you understand that the center cannot be a part of the structure because the center gives meaning to the structure. So God is not part of the earth. God is someone who is beyond earth. He is transcendent. Okay? So God is someone who is not a part of our daily structure of the world. But it is God who gives meaning to this structure. Okay? That's a part of medieval theology. So without that God, you cannot explain the structure of the world. But that God herself or himself is not part of this structure, okay? Beyond the structure. But without that God, you cannot have meaning in this world. The structure will not have meaning. I'll give you another example. Let's come to a philosopher called René Descartes. He is that famous philosopher who said, I think, therefore I am. What does it mean? I think, therefore I am. That it is because of your reason that you understand the world, very simply put. That you exist because of your reason. So your very existence, your meaning of existence is derived from your reason. Okay. So what Descartes again is saying is that everything that you see in this world has meaning. How do you understand that meaning? Through reason. But reason itself you cannot see in this world. So you can see a tree or a dog or a cat or whatever. And reason helps you to understand that this is a tree or a dog or a cat. But you cannot see reason. Reason is beyond that structure. So Derrida says that this is very fun. And this is how the history of Western understanding of structures have developed historically. That you have a structure, but in order to explain the meaning of the structure, you need to have something outside the structure. The center is never inside the structure. It is outside the structure. Okay. So you will need a God to explain the structure. You will need reason to explain the structure. For new critics, you will need irony, paradox, which is not part of the structure, but it will explain how the structure, the meaning of the poem operates. Or you need, in romantics, you need a poet who is outside the structure, but explains the meanings of the structure. Okay. So what Derrida points out is that it's interesting that why do we keep on doing it? Why do we need to invent something which is beyond the structure? Why do we need to invent something like God or reason or whatever, in Hegel, dialectic, etc. So why do we need something which is not part of the structure but should explain the structure? Why do we need it? The problem, Derrida points out, is that there is a natural fear of what he calls dissemination of meaning. Because if the world doesn't mean, then it's a very chaotic world for human beings. We need to grasp to meanings. We need to have some solidity to our meanings. In order to exist, we have to understand how the world operates. But unfortunately, the world doesn't care about us because the world will operate in its own way. What we try to do is we try to impose a certain kind of structure onto the world. And because it is uncontrollable, because that structure is never stable, it is never reliable, it gives you different kinds of contradictory meanings, you then need an extraneous center, a center that is not part of that system, of that structure, to stabilize the meaning. So, for example, you need the figure of a text. So you need a book, a printed book, which will tell you this is a book, this should have meaning. Okay. Or you need the figure of the author, where you can say, some author has written it. Obviously, the author is not part of the book, but since the author has written it, there has to be some meaning in it. Okay. So you need that stability. The author figure can then be used to produce that stability. So I can say that the author says this and therefore stabilizes the meaning. I can say that the text says this and therefore you cannot say, reinterpret the text. Okay. Or I can say, this is what writing does. So writing is something that needs to be done in a certain way, and therefore I'll contain the meaning of writing. Okay. It is this difference between trying to understand the relationship between structures that structuralism does, to the fact that the structure itself is an unstable mechanism to understand any literature, that we move from structuralism to post-structuralism. What Derrida would go on to say, and many other writers of the post-structuralist movement, well, I'll not call it movement, post-structuralist theorists, is to question the idea of structure itself. Okay. So people like Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, if you have read a book by Lyotard, one of the most famous ones, called The Postmodern Condition, is that to question the very idea that there are stable meanings that can be achieved. Because that seems to be a certain kind of a fantasy, a desire. And since I mentioned Lacan, and since I talked about desire, let me also say what Lacan has to say about this. So Lacan, remember, has nothing to do with literature, but he has a very interesting essay on Edgar Allan Poe, whom I mentioned earlier. And that essay is called A Purloined Letter. Okay. In fact, Poe has a story called The Purloined Letter. And the story is something like this. There is a very famous minister, and someone has written a letter to him. It's a very problematic letter, because if the letter is revealed, then the minister will lose all his prestige, all his rank. It will be a big scandal. He doesn't want that scandal to happen. Okay? So he gets a detective to find that letter, because he has received that letter, but he can't find it. So the entire story is about trying to find that letter. And finally, the detective in the story, Monsieur Dupont, says that we have looked at all the possibilities, all the places where that letter could have been. But we have not looked at the basic possibility that the best place for hiding anything is right in front of your eyes. When you're looking for something, and you must have experienced it yourself, that you lost a key, it's lying right in front of you, but you don't see it. You try to look for it somewhere else. So they go and actually find the letter right on the table of the minister and gives it back to him. So that's a story. Now, what is Lacan doing with that story? So Lacan says this is exactly the nature of desire, human desire. So what does desire do? It creates this illusory others. So for example, when a child of 9 months stands in front of a mirror, not a literal mirror, but metaphorical mirror, the child thinks that I have a fully grown body, I have my hands, my legs, my whatever in my head, my eyes, etc., and assumes that the child is complete. But the child is not, because the child still doesn't have proper coordination of movements, proper coordination of speech, but that image, that illusion, creates what Lacan calls the ego. And because it produces that ego, that illusory self, okay, the human desire always is based on this idea of something is lacking, okay, something that you can't see. You want to see, but you can't see. You want to see, but you can't see. Okay. The search for meaning in post-structuralism is something akin to this human desire. You want to produce meaning in a world that is only based on differences. Remember Saussure? So a signifier means only through differences. And because it's a series of differences that are produced, there is no fixed, stable meaning that you can attach to. Because the moment you reach a meaning, again, the meaning itself is located in a system of differences. Just to give you a very simple example, if I say a book, now I can, if someone asks me what is the meaning of a book, I say, okay, it's a text. But again, the word text can have meaning only with differences to other meanings. So if someone says, then what is a text? Then I say, well, the text is a collection of pages with might be a story, and it will have a cover and end, but I've used too many words now. So again, these words will have meaning through differences. So it's an endless chain of differences. But our basic human desire is to control that chain. Okay. And therefore, we need to invent some sort of a meaning stabilizer. And that meaning stabilizer can be a god, an author, a critic, etc., etc. So what post-structuralism therefore does as it moves forward, and I'll stop over here, is it questions the basic assumption that understanding the structure actually gives us an understanding of the world. Okay. And goes back to the original position that Saussure took, that language has no relation with reality. Okay. Language creates a sense of reality. It is not really related to what is real outside. Okay. If you remember the example of a tree, we call it a tree, but there is no real relationship between the word tree and the object that we say as true. So what post-structuralist critics therefore do when they move away from structuralism, especially with people like Foucault and Derrida and others, is that they look at a literary text or any production of literature, be it poetry or novel or whatever, any kind of fiction or drama, as something that contains an endless excess of meanings. And because it has this endless excess of meanings, the task of a critic, especially for a post-structuralist critic, is not to show what the meaning of a text is, but to show that the meaning of the text themselves are temporary, unstable. Okay. And this is, and if you read Derrida, this is what Derrida does in text after text after text. So he will take up, for example, a philosopher and shows the inherent contradictions that are contained in the structure of that text itself. So while the person is saying something and at the same time contradicting himself or herself later. So this endless play of meaning is something that, so Derrida is not saying that things are meaningless. Okay, there's no meaning. What he's saying is that imposition of a particular kind of meaning is always problematic. So a text has not simply multiple meanings, but a text has an endless stream of meaning, which are always deconstructing themselves. And this leads us to the theory of deconstruction, etc. Okay. Just before I end, in 1 minute, I'll just say that some of the good texts to read on structuralism and post-structuralism, I still find David Lodge as a good introduction. So do read David Lodge. But there are a lot of new books that have come up on structuralism and post-structuralism, especially this Hans Burton's book called An Introduction to Literary Theory. But I still find Terry Eagleton's Literary Theory and Introduction a very interesting book, where he brings in all these debates together. If you have any questions, please ask. I'll stop now.
Did you miss it? We lost connection for 5-10 minutes when you switched from structuralism to post-structuralism.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the students. Those who were on YouTube, they had no problem. But did you have the problem? Student participants?
No, sir.
I think they were all here. I didn't see anyone
Oh.
disappearing.
Any questions?
You can unmute yourself and ask a question. I mean, you don't have to chat. Right.
Questions. Khushi put a question.
Yes, sir. There is a question from Devang Darji on YouTube live stream. He asked that because meaning is not stable in the frame of reference of the Saussurean concept, so I would like to ask, can we read or understand the text through the lens of Saussure?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part? I didn't get that.
Because meaning is not stable in the frame of reference of the Saussurean concept. So I would like to ask, can we read or understand the text through the lens of Saussure?
Yes, of course. I mean, that is what structuralism did. So I gave you the examples of Vladimir Prop. And so what does Saussure's theory do? It tells you that it is not simply a literary text that has structures. So the moment you start understanding language as a system of signs, then anything can have a structure. So for example, even a traffic light has a structure. So there is orange, there is yellow, there is orange, green, red, etc. So even traffic light will have a structure. Similarly, films will have a structure because they are visual in nature. So that is what Saussure is doing. So it's the Saussurean theory can be used to understand anything because anything can be a sign system. But the assumption is that the sign system will have a signifier and a signified and a structure of meaning. So the signifier and the signified is based on differences. In fact, Saussure very famously once said that you cannot have a language with one sound because you need at least two sounds to produce a language. Because until unless one sound is different from the other, you cannot have a language. So that basic system of differences produces meanings. And therefore, text can be read through systems of differences. So when I talked about Prop, for example, 31 functions, they are different from each other. And that's how they produce meanings of a Russian folktale. Or when I talked about Althusser, the idea of the state as different sorts of structures that operate in different ways. is something that is based on the Saussurean notion of signifier, signified, etc. The only difference is that with post-structuralism, of course, this is questioned, that the idea that the structures can produce stable meanings, post-structuralists like Derrida would say is problematic, because there are no stable meanings in this structural formation. Okay? They're arbitrary, they're conventional. But the moment you try to impose a stable meaning, then it becomes a problem, because then you need to invent something which is outside the structure. For example, the author gives stability in meanings, etc. So I didn't mention Kristeva at all. Kristeva is important. I didn't talk about feminism at all. So Kristeva definitely is important, but I think the two most important things that she talks about is what we call the phenotext and the genotext. Now, Kristeva, I would group her more as a structuralist with a difference. Well, there is a part of Kristeva which is kind of post-structuralist, which questions the structure. So if you have, so do read her very famous essay called "The System and the Speaking Subject," where Kristeva talks about this. So the system is something that has got a structure, right? You have a signifier, you have a signified, etc. But Kristeva says the problem with the system is that it doesn't really. So I can give you a system of meaning. So this is how meaning is produced. But it does not take into consideration individual utterances. For example, no individual produces the same utterance. So you might describe the thing in a certain way using the same system. I might describe the same thing in a completely different way using the same system of structures. So what Kristeva would argue for, what she calls the genotext and the phenotext. So the genotext is the system. The phenotext is the individual speaking subject. And she says both has to be taken into account, because every utterance at the moment of production kind of changes the system a bit. So you can't assume the system is a stable one. So the very fact that you can utter something, and that is what, for example, many artists do, isn't it? They defamiliarize, they shock you, because they have never thought of meaning being produced in a certain way. I'll give you an example of early 20th century. So in one of the most famous installations that an early surrealist called Duchamp did was he asked people to come into a museum where he said that my artwork is going to be displayed. And he actually put a toilet seat. That's all that he did, because he put a toilet seat and said, that's my artwork. So there's this ability to shock, this ability to violate the system. Okay. And that is what Kristeva would say produces the phenotext. That is the one which produces the possibility of subversion of the system. And that is what Derrida is also saying. So the subversive possibilities of the system are contained within the system. And that's why avant-garde artists, that's how people who deal with literature or fine arts or visual paintings or films, that's how they manipulate, they change the system. So it's not that the structures are stable, because there is a possibility of changing the structures that you produce different sorts of meanings, the meanings that you have not thought of, etc. The second part of the question is by which we must go through. So I mentioned the famous five. So of course the Roland Barthes, Lacan, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Levi-Strauss. But other than that, there are quite a few. So you have the American school of post-structuralism with Hayden White, for example. You have the later theorists, which I didn't mention at all, people like Lyotard. So I think it's a good idea to start with a basic text on literary theory, especially this book. I think it's by Hans Baetens, if I'm not wrong. So any basic book that you find on an introduction to literary theory, they will contain most of these things. If you're interested in particular authors, I would suggest that you go to this site called which is basically an encyclopedia of philosophy, but they will contain most of the literary theories as well. So if you want to know in very brief and a very accessible form, because remember, some of these authors are difficult to read. So in an accessible way, if you want to access some of these writings, then, or what they have to say, it's done in an academic fashion, not in notes form, at least, not like Cliff Notes or whatever, and gives you in details what they have to say. So someone is saying Defrance. So Defrance is, so I talked about the desire for meaning, if you remember. So the desire for meaning is you need some sort of a stability. That's why you have that desire for meaning, that there has to be a stable meaning somewhere. And therefore you invent centers outside the structure. What Derrida says is that it's not simply difference. The meaning is not created only through differences, as Saussure says, but it's also created through deference. Now, deference is postponement. Okay, in some of his later writings, Derrida uses the word supplement. So what he means is that you have meaning is of course created through differences, Saussurian differences, but it does not lead you to a very stable referent. Okay, because it leads you to another form of difference. So the meaning is constantly deferred. It is constantly postponed. You can never really reach that ultimate meaning. Okay. But because the desire for the ultimate meaning is so strong in human beings that we need to stabilize it. And therefore, you start inventing things outside the system. You start inventing things outside the structure. So therefore, you need something like a god or a reason or whatever you can call it, any philosophical category that tries to stabilize it. And he says that's a problem. So that's what we don't accept that. We don't accept that deferment at all. But once we accept what he calls the play of languages, once we accept that there is always an excess, once we accept that not everything can be controlled within a structure, then it's probably easier for us to live our lives.
Anyone has any question? I think we have done with it. So thank you very much, Atanuji,
Thank you,
for
sir.
such a enlightening talk on new criticism, formalism, structuralism, and post-structuralism. On behalf of the department, on behalf of the student participants and colleagues, we thank you for sparing your time with us and giving them some glimpses of these four isms, theories, four different theories. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for having me over, and thank you everyone for participating. And see you later. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. चलिए कुछ लाइक